In almost every family, there's one person who gets called the problem, the dramatic one, the difficult one, the one who can't let things go. And very often, they're not the most unstable person in the room, they're just the one who stopped pretending everything was fine. At Thanksgiving dinner, someone asks a simple question. Why does Dad always go quiet whenever Mom's sister gets mentioned? The table doesn't answer it. It redirects fast toward the person who asked. Why do you always have to bring things up? Can we just have one normal dinner? Within 30 seconds, the actual question is gone, replaced entirely by a conversation about the asker's tone. That's not an accident. And it isn't really about that one question either. It's a pattern that shows up in almost every family under enough pressure. One person ends up carrying the label of the problem, and it's rarely the person causing the most damage. Very often, it's the person who simply stopped pretending there wasn't one. Think of a family less like a group of separate individuals and more like an orchestra mid-performance. If the tempo the conductor is setting keeps drifting, almost every instrument can compensate quietly, adjusting just enough to stay roughly together. But there's usually one instrument, maybe the one playing the most exposed part, that can't hide the drift. It comes in a fraction late or a note too sharp, and from the audience, that's the only sound anyone actually notices. The easy conclusion is that the musician can't keep time. The harder, truer explanation is that the drift belongs to the whole ensemble, and that instrument just happened to be the one built to reveal it. Families work in something close to that way. Tension between two parents, an unspoken grief, resentment nobody's named out loud, none of that stays neatly contained in the two people who created it. It moves through the whole system, and it tends to surface loudest through whichever family member is least willing or least able to pretend the tension isn't there. Family therapists have a term for the person who ends up carrying that visible symptom, while the actual pressure sits somewhere else entirely. Psychiatrist Murray Bowen, one of the founding figures of family systems thinking, described families as functioning like a single emotional unit rather than a collection of independent people. Under his framework, a symptom showing up in one person often makes more sense once you look at what's happening in the relationships around them, not just inside them. Picture the mechanics of how this actually plays out. A marriage has gone quiet in a specific cold way, not fighting exactly, just distant. Nobody names it. Then a teenager at that same table snaps over something small, a comment about their grades, their friends, their tone. Suddenly there's a subject everyone can agree on, the teenager's attitude. The parents, who hadn't spoken warmly to each other in weeks, are suddenly united again, standing together against a shared concern. The original tension hasn't gone anywhere. It's just changed addresses, and it's now living inside the person everyone agrees is the difficult one. If any of this feels uncomfortably familiar, it's worth staying for the rest of it, and subscribing keeps it easy to find later. Here's what makes this role so disorienting from the inside. The person carrying it usually isn't wrong about what they're sensing. They notice the real thing, the joke that wasn't really a joke, the silence after a certain name gets mentioned, the different rules applied to a favored sibling. But every time they say what they noticed out loud, the family's attention doesn't move toward the thing they pointed at. It moves toward them. Why do you always make everything about you? Why can't you just let it go? Over enough repetitions, the person doing the noticing starts doubting the noticing itself, which is a much deeper cost than simply being blamed for one bad dinner. This isn't always a conscious decision by anyone involved. Nobody sits down and votes on who becomes the family's designated problem. It usually forms slowly, out of small moments repeated for years. The child who asked the uncomfortable question got called dramatic once, then again, then it just became understood as fact. And it's worth being honest here too, since this isn't a free pass for every blamed person's behavior. Someone can be genuinely reacting to real dysfunction and still express that reaction in ways that hurt people who didn't create the dysfunction in the first place. The pattern doesn't erase personal responsibility. It just widens the camera angle enough to see what's actually generating the pressure. The role tends to survive far longer than the conditions that created it, which is part of what makes it so strange to live inside. An adult sibling can walk into a family gathering 20 years later, calm, successful, entirely unremarkable in every visible way, and still watch the room brace slightly the moment they speak, as if the old instrument is about to come in flat again out of habit. The label outlasts the evidence for it by a long way, because the family isn't actually reacting to who that person is now. They're reacting to a role the system built and never formally retired. Research on how families organize around a single member's distress backs up the basic shape of this. Studies on family functioning have found that when the emotional weight of a household consistently lands on one child rather than being acknowledged across the family as a whole, that child tends to carry a disproportionate share of the resulting anxiety and behavioral difficulty. The effect isn't about that child being inherently more fragile. It's about where the system decided the pressure should go. This explains a strange thing that sometimes happens when the problem person actually improves. They move out, start therapy, get calmer, more direct, less reactive. Instead of relief, the family sometimes feels a spike in tension instead, because the person who used to absorb the unnamed stress isn't absorbing it anymore, and now it has nowhere obvious to land. Occasionally, another family member gets quietly nominated to take over the role, almost without anyone deciding to do it on purpose. The system wasn't actually trying to fix the one person. None of this means walking around blaming the rest of the family for everything either. Most of this happens completely outside anyone's awareness. People aren't usually choosing cruelty. They're protecting whatever feels necessary to keep the unit functioning, even when that protection costs someone else dearly. Understanding the mechanism isn't about assigning a new villain, it's about finally separating the reaction from the identity built on top of it. That separation is the actual turning point. You can hold, I really did snap at people, I really did withdraw, I really did learn habits that now hurt people who had nothing to do with any of this as true, without also accepting, and that means the entire tension in that house started with me. Those are two different claims, and only one of them was ever really yours to carry. Naming that difference out loud, even just to yourself, tends to do something a lifetime of defending yourself never managed. It lets the accusation exist without automatically becoming a verdict. Maybe the anger wasn't proof of being born difficult. Maybe it was the only language available when quiet discomfort kept getting ignored. Maybe the hypervigilance wasn't a personality flaw. Maybe a nervous system just learned to scan constantly because the emotional weather at home used to shift without warning, and scanning was the only way to see it coming. Go back to that orchestra for a second. For years, everyone in the room kept staring at the one instrument slightly out of time, asking why it couldn't just stay in rhythm like everyone else. Almost nobody looked at the conductor. Nobody asked what tempo was actually being set, or where the drift started before it ever reached that one exposed part. Sometimes the family member everyone calls the problem isn't broken at all. Sometimes they're just the place where the tension became easiest to hear. And the work was never proving the rest of the family completely wrong. It was learning to tell the difference between the role you were handed and the person you actually are underneath it.